Storytell lead at Worthy Ground, a project hosted around disaster recovery at Invest Appalachia. I'm excited to be conducting today's disaster resilience interview on behalf of the Central Appalachian Network, also known as CAN. And together with ReImagine Appalachia, we've been partnering to do disaster resilient storytelling to inspire hope, simplify creative solutions, and show the growing momentum around more resilient and prosperous community development. Today, we're talking to Dr. Natalie Kruse Daniels, environmental studies professor of environmental studies at Ohio State University. She also heads the Research and Resource Development Subcommittee at CAN's Community Resilience and Adaptation Working Group, known as CRAWG. Her expertise includes land and water remediation, um, groundwater mapping, and acid mine drainage. Natalie, welcome today. We're going to be talking to Natalie about her work of creating a toolkit for emergency response planning that's tailored to the Appalachian region. Thanks for joining us today, Natalie.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm going to jump right in because you do so much. I know you have so much to say. So can you talk about the Research and Resource Development Subcommittee and what the group's objectives are, and what you've learned in the process of your work?
Yeah, so in CRAWG, so the Community Resilience and Adaptation Working Group, we recognize that there is a depth of experience across the region, both in academia and in community-based organizations, in agencies and in local and state governments, that we can pull upon to support being prepared for extreme weather events, for emergency response, and connect those worlds. And so we had really two key goals over the last year. One was to start building a community of practice of folks who are doing research in flooding, in the health effects of extreme weather, so whether that be floods or heat or other things, and in emergency response. And so we have folks who engage from about a dozen universities in Central Appalachia to really build that community of practice, and it's grown over time, and it's that work has deepened. And I'm looking forward to continuing to see that grow and see that evolve. And then our other main objective was, how do we curate resources that can help communities in Central Appalachia be more resilient, be more prepared for extreme weather or other disasters, and really serve the communities that we live in, that we play in, that we call home better. So really making that connection between best practices and the research and things like that, and really what's happening on the ground throughout the region. And so that's been really, really exciting.
Yeah, it's been amazing to see the overall regional coverage that you all have within your network. Disaster preparedness extends far beyond meteorology, and we have to look at local economies, infrastructure, poverty rates, policy, health crisis needs. How has the research subcommittee gone about defining that scope of priorities and not exhaust its capacity along the way?
Well, I think that it's something that we had to like learn through, right? So you go in wanting to kind of do everything, and then really there's this recognition that during a disaster, right, when there's just been a major flood or another a major event, nobody's logging on to an online resource portal to read about how they should prepare for a disaster, right? And so we recognize that much of our audience are the folks in the region who are in local government or community groups or economic development organization, things like that, who might want to really have some regionally specific best practices for making their communities more resilient in the many ways that we need to. And so that allowed us to kind of key in on the preparation resources that support communities in becoming more resilient. And then because of both the different resources that are available in our region, but then also the expertise of the folks in our committee and in our community practice, and this recognition that one of the places that we really have gaps um, is in that understanding of how can we be more prepared for disasters, both through community connections and the networks and the systems we build within our communities, and also adapting our infrastructure and physical systems to be more resilient. And so that can look like things like communications planning, how to build resilience hubs in a rural area, right? Understanding it's really different than urban settings. But it can also be things like, um, infrastructure changes that allow there to be more room for floodwaters. So you reduce the risk to communities, or, identifying bridges and culverts that fail most often. And so trying to focus in on those places where there's not another regional resource that serves that, and also where we think we can actually, contribute collective expertise of this community practice to the region.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Obviously, when you're researching for a subject as complex as disaster preparedness, it's essential to collect information from institutions and federal agencies. But are there any pieces of insight you've gathered just from impacted individuals that have been especially key to guiding your research along the way?
Yes, and in multiple ways, right? So I think, from research that I've guided, um, prior to this effort, but then also through this effort and the work of CRAWG, we have been able to engage with just community members who have experienced disaster and understand their experience and what has helped and what hasn't helped. Understand what resources folks need, but then also what they draw on during a disaster, or what they wish they maybe had done previously had they known, or the resources were in place to do that. We've done work with emergency management agencies and local health departments to understand some of the gaps there, because right, these are really multi-agency and multi-player responses typically. And so you have your community organizations, and you have the Red Cross, and you have the churches, and you have just neighbors helping neighbors, and you also have the EMA, and you have the health department and fire departments and things like that, who all have to collaborate. And so trying to learn from all of those folks is really, really important. And so while it's not like a systematic study, some of those pieces have been like systematic academic research, but while overall that's not, it has really informed what the places we've gone into more depth are the places that we now want to grow into, to expand the resources that we're curating in the region.
Yeah, it's amazing because each of these entities have their own unique experience and response. So having all of that input is so beneficial. The Research and Resource Development Subcommittee has cataloged invaluable resources, but much of it is digitally archived. Are there any strategies you have identifying for delivering critical information? And you hit on this a little bit, to residents who have limited or no internet access.
I think it's a really huge issue that you raise just across our region, right? I think that folks who don't live in Central Appalachia often do not get the scarcity of broadband and internet, particularly in a disaster, right? And we know, like, worldwide, that one of the biggest impacts during disasters is lack of communication, right? Like when the grids are down, when communication's down, right? And that's where, we've really leaned into that role of saying, okay, how do we as communities, what are the resources that we can put into this toolkit, into this, this resource hub that can help communities plan ahead, right? Understanding that there are some really systematic reasons why we we lose communication during disasters in Appalachia and elsewhere, but sometimes it's worse in Appalachia just because a lot of the infrastructure is already a little spottier. Um, And so understanding that a lot of what we need to do is prepare, right? A lot of what we need to do is understand, okay, we know that we have vulnerable folks who are likely to not have internet access. But also one thing that we see, and this isn't specific to the work of CRAWG, but additional work that I've done through my professional career, is that there are a lot of communities in the region where the way that a lot of public entities are communicating before, during, and after an emergency is on social media, right? It's on Facebook. There are a lot of local governments that don't have the capacity to have a continually updated web presence that allows them to push out alerts, for example. And so they rely on social media, but we know that that's a big gap in the sort of populations that serves, right? If you're putting emergency warnings out on Facebook, you're going to serve people who are my age, right? You're not going to serve folks who don't have internet access or who don't have a smartphone, or young people, older adults who are really vulnerable during emergency situations. And so what we have to do when we're thinking about these resources is, how do we pull together resources that support local communications planning? I'll give an example. There's a county near where I am in Appalachian, Ohio, where they did really excellent preparation work, multi-agency planning for a winter storm. Right. So they did tabletop exercises and things like that. And like the next year, there was a really severe winter storm, knocked out power and transportation to a ton of people. But because they had just done that planning exercise, everyone knew what their job was, and everyone knew what the communication paths were, and everyone knew where the emergency shelters were going to be. But they also knew who were the vulnerable folks that were going to need help to either get transported to a shelter, or to at least have a neighbor check in on them. And so those sort of things are fundamental in our region to appropriate emergency response. Like that's the game changer in terms of outcomes, is knowing ahead of time, kind of like, do we have neighbors who can check on the older adult who's going to be really vulnerable? Or do we have a plan for, like, we know that we're probably going to lose power in this area? Like, who's reliant on a CPAP or reliant on a dialysis machine or oxygen concentrator, or has insulin that needs to be refrigerated, that we know ahead of time that's a response that needs to be part of it, and we don't need to rely on broadband to do that. So that was just like a really multifaceted response to that. But I think it's something that's really fundamental, is that we have to understand, in a disaster, we're likely to have no communication. So we have to have a plan ahead of time that everyone can act on and knows about and stays up to date.
Yeah, that's amazing and very critical. We experienced it after the 2022 floods in East Kentucky. Helene, you just don't realize how disconnected you are when those grids go down until you're in it. So having that preparation ahead is critical. As you build out this toolkit for communities, the next step is obviously implementing disaster readiness strategies. Have you gotten a sense for how receptive local governments are to adopting these best practices? And what obstacles remain in place for the implementation of these resilient strategies that you've been identifying?
So, in terms of receptiveness, I think so many of our communities in Appalachia have experienced disasters in the last decade. And that really changes the flavor of how we work together. It's really changed, I know where I am, it's really changed how, like, our local health departments and EMAs collaborate across, like, a multi-county region. In Eastern Kentucky, I've worked with some incredible local leaders who care about the people that they serve and the communities they serve, and, are committed to continuing to serve those people better over time, right? So I think that, unfortunately, our lived experience has created that commitment. Where I think we have challenges and barriers is, one, that we have a systematic lack of capacity, right? When we're asking people to attend a public meeting or a training or do a county-wide tabletop exercise to plan for our response to the next event, it means that those folks aren't doing something else, right? And a lot of our region relies on volunteer fire, and many places don't have local law enforcement, for example, or the same person is the floodplain manager and also, runs the grocery store. And so you're talking about places where we really rely on committed people. And so asking more of them is really hard. And I think that that's actually like one of the biggest challenges, one of the biggest barriers. And so one of the next steps, one of the things that we're trying to move towards is how do we make the resources that we've curated in this toolkit, in this hub, how do we make sure that there are some really actionable, digestible pieces that draw from these best practices, whether they're national or regional, that make it an easy implementation, right? Make something that you can hand to somebody and say, here is a half-day thing for your countywide meeting to plan for the next flood. And these are the outcomes that you have to have, right? And so essentially being able to do that. But I think that even you hand the easiest to follow guidance to somebody and you have the most committed local government, you still have to have the capacity. You still have to have the people having the time to be there together and not be doing something else during that time, right? Ideally, you have somebody external facilitating those sort of things, right? Ideally, you have those things. And we know from our work with communities that we're going to identify gaps and we need ways to fill those gaps. So whether that's that there's no early warning for floods in much of rural Eastern Kentucky, where we know folks are incredibly vulnerable, or whether it's that there's whole counties with no rain gauges, or or that you really do have these really amazing public servants serving multiple roles within their local government who can't take a half day to go do this multi-agency planning and preparation, that we have to figure out, like, how do we as a region do that and support folks in doing that? And I don't have the answer to that, but I think that that's the biggest barrier. It's not because people don't see the issue.
Yeah, and so many are recovering from disasters of the past that it's difficult to think about disasters of the future. But it's amazing that you all are thinking about those digestible ways to hand those over to smaller communities and build that capacity. Um, even with the even with the current challenges in place, can you give us a vision of how a community would be able to respond to at the event of a natural disaster, if it were utilizing the resources you have worked to provide? And this is sorry, I'm going to ask you a few questions here. And how might various local agencies mobilize? What preparations would residents have already made? What vital supports would be available to residents at local resilience hubs? And just kind of give us a vision of how those work together.
All right. So knowing that, we're continuing to grow and evolve and adapt to, the needs of the communities we serve, right, in terms of the resources, the ideal vision, right, is that we're able to implement some early warning systems. So I'm thinking about flooding events because that's a lot of what I work in. I'm implementing some early warning systems so that we know when the river is going to come up. There are really strong guides for implementing this broad category of nature-based solutions, which essentially means, like, how can we use floodplains and wetlands and ponds and green sinks and things like that to give the water more space, right? Because we have like a complicated land use history and because of some of the geography and topography of our region, we have a lot of folks living in pretty vulnerable areas, but we also have streams that kind of are confined to a channel. And so they're in the channel or they're massively flooding, right? If we can give them more of a natural floodplain or, basins or detention or wetlands where water can go to slow it down and give just more holding, it can drop flood levels some, right? So that's like early warning, implementing of some of those solutions are two big things. You mentioned resilience hubs, and we have materials about resilience hubs and some best practices there. And when we talk about resilience hubs, oftentimes we think in nationally, you think about the resilience hub that have been developed in urban areas where like it might be a community center that has backup power and backup water. And during a disaster, it's where, FEMA would go, or where, local response would be rooted in that place, right? We know that in a lot of rural areas, especially in flood events, you have a lot of flooded roads. So people can't make it places. And so you can really lean into this vision of something called a hub and spoke model for resilience hubs, where you have a main staging area. And that could be a church, that could be a community center, that could be a library, that could be a lot of different things. And then that you lean into those natural places that people already trust and already seek that kind of response and community. So, is there an old school or a gym or a senior center or the matriarch of the community's porch, or a grocery store, a convenience store, or a local restaurant that people tend to go to that is on higher ground, right? That is safe in floods. And then how do we co-locate a school? Sorry, I forgot that. That's important. How do we co-locate some resources, right? Is it that we figure out as a county or as a region that we will need to pre-position, a certain amount of backstock water at the local convenience store that they know they're going to get paid for, so that in a disaster, there's water? Or is it that we need to coordinate, like, who has a boat, a chainsaw, an ATV, and know that ahead of time and pre-position? We say it like pre-position assets. I know it sounds like real fancy, but it's literally making sure you got food and water and some backup shelter. Is it having a pop-up pavilion tent that's stored in a shed in the parking lot of the local school that's up the hill, so that when a storm's coming in, you have people who it's their job to go pop up that tent, and that's where people can go and be dry, and they can go ahead of time. And we know that there's, water or water filtration and some backup food and, other resources that are important for folks there. And then that hub, right, that community center, the library, or the church or whatever, that's more central to a community where there's more storage space, has longer term response materials, right? But that we know that like this little community, it's the folks there until the water comes back down. It's only that, right? It's only the folks who are flooded in there that are going to work together. And so how do we make sure that we agree on a space that during that, critical first, 36, 48, 72 hours, that there's, like I say, like pre-positioned water, some like food, blankets, basics that get you through that until you can have outside help, right? And so like the vision, right, would be that you have, preparation, you have things ready as a community, whether it be, there are portable shower and bathroom blocks. There are, campgrounds that are at higher elevation where maybe the showers and the washing machines can keep running. Generator run refrigerators, fans, lights, things like that, where you can have those pre-positioned when an emergency may occur. But some of that relies on us having enough early warning, right? It relies on us maybe having more rain gauges in the region, things like that. And so I think like that overall vision is that of pre-positioning assets, having enough information to know when we might have to mobilize them. Like, what's the trigger, right? If you are in Whitesburg, how much rain should make you move up the hill, right? And I think that that's a tricky question when we don't have kind of enough like small scale information. And so I just gave like a really long answer to what was a reasonably simple question, but that idea of like ahead of a disaster, where you're going to go, where the supplies are, who's responsible for doing what, and that's communicated well to everybody, and that we have enough information to know that a big flood's coming. And we have gaps in both those places right now in many of our communities.
I love that, and I think as someone who's done mutual aid organizing for years, I've always sort of said, like, you call the churches and the fire departments first in a small town. So I love the hub and spoke model that you're talking about there. Um, and this is my last question for you. Thank you so much. But Appalachia has many issues known to contribute to flooding. Towns constructed in floodplains, poverty industries that have cleared flood absorbent forests and worsened our soil quality, and as we talked about, limited broadband access. Um, but what I'd like to know is, what do you think are Appalachia's unique strengths for responding to natural disasters that we can really lean into?
I think it's our people and our commitment to each other, right? It's that sense of place and that rootedness in our region. It's knowing our neighbors and knowing that people are going to show up and help each other, right? It's knowing that, like, without even asking, somebody's probably going to show up with their chainsaw and cut the log out that's blocking your driveway, right? And that is really one of our biggest assets, is that connectedness. It's that sense of place. It's that sense of community. And so in many ways, that's something we really want to lead into. But that means that's also a place where we need to put energy. We need to put, we need to invest in, whether that be money or time, or, just recognizing that that's one of the biggest assets that we have. Like if I go academic on you, right? One of the strongest pieces of evidence, one of the biggest things that predicts whether an older adult is going to have a positive or a negative health outcome from a disaster is their community, is their social structure, and that is absolutely critical to their outcomes. And so leaning into that social structure, right? It may not be that an agency can respond to each person, right? But if we know our community and know that, like, there is an older person living alone, and that we have that sense of responsibility to go and check on them and help them, that those are the sort of networks that we really want to lean into to improve outcomes, right? And so, like, yeah, that's supported by literature as well, right? It's supported, like, those communities, those connections. That's really what makes or breaks the outcomes, particularly in a region like ours.
It's beautiful, and we see so many differences that might separate us in community fade away in those days after disaster, because at the
Absolutely.
root we care about our neighbors.
Mhm.
Well, thank you, Natalie, so much for joining us. This concludes today's interview, and please be sure to visit CAN's new resource hub, www.cannetwork.org, to access the invaluable research and toolkits that Natalie has spoke about today. And you can also hear more in-depth discussions on Appalachia-specific disaster mitigation by heading over to worthyground.org to watch me interview resilience leaders and have communities really focus on their efforts around recovery. But for now, wish you all a wonderful day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.